Welcome to Keith and I Don't Tread on Anyone in the Libertarian Institute. Today, I am joined by Marcel Gautreau. He is here to discuss, first of all, his excellent book club, which can be found at Property and Freedom Books. He is now on the, is it fifth or sixth book you guys are
This is
going
now
through?
our fifth book. We used to do books over at the Austrian Economics Discord server, but we migrated over when we started doing books that were less about economics.
Oh, nice. Yes, Property and Freedom Books. For those of us who can't make the Property and Freedom Summit in Turkey every year, you can join this Discord. Links will be in the description below. Marcel, how did you get into economics?
Ron Paul 2012, I'm pretty sure. I mean, that was how I got into libertarianism. I do believe when I was an undergrad, I was a political science major at first. I had to take, an intro to micro course. And I realized, economics pays a lot better than political science anyway. I have plenty of free time in my hands for the college credits. So I double majored into econ and followed it all the way through.
Awesome. As far as your favorite economists, give me one or two of your favorites and what you like most about their work.
Well, I'm contractually obligated to say Murray Rothbard, of course. Besides this, critical Austro-libertarian spread, Mises, of course. I've been reading more DiLorenzo to accommodate myself to the new order of things at the Mises Institute. Thomas Sowell was actually the first one I ever read. I know it's pretty cliche, but his Economic Facts and Fallacies was the first economics book that I chose to read. So.
Interesting. What I love about that book is it's not full of a bunch of graphs and everything. He has just the devastating takedown of the myth of the gender pay gap. I really like Sowell's work. Give me one thing about Mises that you think is underappreciated that you'd like to teach the audience.
His sheer comprehensiveness. So I've now had to read Human Action 4 times. Once at the GMU Austrian course, twice Rothbard graduate seminar, and then just in various interspersed ways, just on my own time. And I would say for people who find reading Mises very intimidating, Human Action is like a real door stopper. I've got two the pocket edition of Human Action. You can really tell it's marketed to libertarians because it only fits into cargo pants. That's the only pocket I've ever seen it ever fit into. But I find that the best way to get into it is to just, flip straight to the back, go to the index and just scroll through and decide I wonder what Mises has to say about Moloch. I'm sure there's something in there that's actually a real index entry. I remember it quite vividly. But he was talking broadly about this idea of consuming future productivity for the present. And he compares basically overconsumption of future goods to sacrificing your children on the altar to a Canaanite demon.
I was going to say, I don't remember the Bohemian Grove section. I will have to go back. What I love about Human Action is his constant emphasis on the importance of social cooperation. For some reason, the philosophy of voluntary interaction has been sold or accepted as every man for himself on an island doing things that don't affect anyone. And that was never ever the way that it was sold by Hazlitt, Mises, Rothbard. It always necessarily meant creating value for value with other people. It necessarily excludes Robinson Crusoe alone on the goddamn island.
I think it's something to do with maybe just the history of America or the demographic pattern of who in America becomes libertarian. But it's really fascinating because, all of our pioneering economists, philosophers were all consummate urbanites. I mean, Mises was born in Lemberg, which was, this one population spike in rural Ukraine, or it was Austria-Hungary back then. It's in Ukraine now. Rothbard was afraid to leave the boundaries of New York City or even fly to Connecticut. All of our people are all city people. The idea that all of them said no, we're creating a philosophy for living like cowboys on the frontier. This was never in the cards for us. And I really, getting into the habit of, this is why we're kind of Lee Kuan Yew enjoyers, at least I am. Yes. I always say the model of our society is not, the Seven Samurai or the Magnificent Seven or whichever. It's the same story, just so everybody knows. That's not our ideal. The ideal is, living in a major city with a thriving financial industry. Singapore is what we want.
The one non-evil thing I've ever read from Henry Kissinger was his section in a book titled Leadership on Lee Kuan Yew. If you come across that, it is very, very much worth your time to read. So I want to talk about the books that you guys discuss in this book club. Tell me something interesting that you came across when reading The Politically Incorrect Guide to American History by Dr. Thomas E. Woods Jr.
That was not a book club book, I should say. So the
Oh, it
books I
wasn't
did for
on.
Right Wing Reading Rainbow, and then there is some overlap to it, but it's not the same. I should have clarified that.
Oh, okay.
I read Tom Woods'
mistook.
Political Guide, and as I mentioned in the article, it really undersells itself. I said so in the first chapter or in the first paragraph of the article, but when I saw that book in the Mises Library, I took one look at it. I'm like, I don't need this book. I'm too smart for this book. I really was like, this book is. I mean, if anybody, just go look up the cover to Tom Woods' Political Guide to American History. I mean, I love Tom, but like, look at it. Did you know that the American revolutionaries were actually conservatives? Like, okay, Tom, thank you. You know? And then, you flip through the index, or you just look through, it's like, this is like some high level, my friend called it a cognito hazard, in like a boomer mascot suit. Because he is citing, David Hackett Fisher. I think he cited Harry Elmer Barnes. There's I'm not going to say there's one other one who's like a real no-no. And he's really just going through all of them.
I got to know who the real no-no is. Jared Taylor?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. He's just going through all of it. And this is like really good stuff. It's a great, survey intro to like right libertarian history, right libertarian revisionism.
Yes, I love when he mentions the fact that, in 1983, the Department of Education did a survey and found out that this very large busing program, which they continue to brag about, had no discernible effect on Black education, which is like, oh, why did they think it would? It's like Asians have higher scores than whites. We need to force whites into more Asian schools. What kind of thinking what did you guys expect?
When we get to Age of Entitlement, there's a part where Caldwell describes how during the debate over, I think it was CR 68, where they discuss how where a few senators said, like, by the logic in this law, you're going to need to do some kind of busing program to get anything close to it. And I think it was Ted Kennedy who says, like, I don't see anything about busing anywhere in the text of this law.
Well, Dr. Wilfred Riley wrote a great book titled Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, and he found, to my surprise, I want you to guess, what percentage of blacks and whites supported busing in a New York Times 1973 poll?
I'm going to guess, like, not even half of blacks. Probably, I'm going to guess, like, 30% of blacks might have supported busing.
9% of blacks and 4% of whites.
Oh, that's even lower.
This thing that was sold to me, I would have guessed 80% of blacks supported it, just because I had never put thought into it. So I'm like, oh yeah, that would have been popular. And if anytime you're trying to appease a crowd, that might be the response. But this just blew me away, how I was completely shadowed by this historical narrative, this prevailing interpretation of previous events. And I had never said, well, what does the actual data show? And is that reliable? And what do competing sources say? It never occurred to me to say, well, if we're fighting on behalf of Group X, what percentage of Group X wants to engage in the activity? Just amazing.
There was another civil rights era program that blacks are really against, which is like interracial adoptions. So in the present situation, if you try to adopt a child and you say anything even close to, I want to adopt a white child, the agency is basically legally obliged to just like kick you out, like eject from the premises by force. You can't say anything like this. And it used to be the policy in this country, and as you can imagine, out to like the 60s and early 70s, that people tried to I think they called it culture matching, adoptive children with adoptees. And in the foster care system, there was an organization, I think it was called like the Black Association of Foster Parents or something along this, but they were very strongly in favor of like racially matching adoptive children. And sometime in the 70s or 80s, there was just this huge push, like, no, not only are we not going to encourage this, but we need to like actively encourage, but what happens in the end is just that people, whites start adopting children from abroad. There's like a whole thing about this. People will adopt outside of their ethnic group if the alternative is to get somebody who's like disabled. So if you are, for the typical white person who's like adopting a child, able-bodied white kid is like the gold standard, right? Then, able-bodied black kid, then like physically disabled white kid. That's like the way that it goes. And so for a long time, the primary source for white families in America who wanted to adopt was from Russia. Like they adopted from Russia, and then it was in 2011 or 2012 where America's laws on marriage were changed, and Vladimir Putin, said, well, given that America has changed the composition of its families and the composition of who's adopting children, he's going to restrict certain couples from adopting children. And then Barack Obama said, well, if these couples can't adopt, then no couples can adopt Russian children. And so now
we're staging a coup in Ukraine. That's it. Yeah, that was the red line.
We thought it was about Crimea. Actually, it was about Obergefell. Yeah.
Victoria Nuland called Jeffrey Pyatt. We're getting this thing in motion. Okay, one last thing on politically incorrect guide. So Tom Woods does this thing where he mentions the Great Society programs. From 1950 until 1968, the poverty rate had steadily declined by about 1% point per year. In the years since the Great Society programs, the poverty rate has stagnated. Now, that lesson of looking not when trying to understand a policy, it's common you look at the year it was implemented and then what happened after. What Woods does is the same thing Soul heroically does in civil rights rhetoric or reality.
Look at the trend line before.
Where he goes, okay, let's look at what happened before. So I learned this concept from Soul and Woods. So when I say, well, the Australian gun ban drastically decreased gun deaths. If you look at where they were going before or compare them in the same time frame to the United States, they were dropping at a faster rate previously. The OSHA deaths is now become the primary example, where after OSHA, workplace deaths fell dramatically. You got to concede that. It's worth noting they were falling at a faster rate before the implementation of OSHA. All right. Anything else on the brilliant Tom Woods Politically Incorrect Guide?
Nothing I haven't already written yet. It's just a very good book. Everybody, do not judge that book by its cover. You have to read it.
Every chapter is so short and concise. It really gives you an incentive to mark the book up and go back to reading. Next book, The Mystery of Banking by Murray Rothbard. I have not read this book. Give me a really good lesson you learned from reading this book.
So I'll be honest with you, the first, 2/3 of the book are price theory and how banks work. So the real, for me, and for those of us, me, yourself, probably others listening to this podcast who are already economically initiated, the real gem is in the final third of it, where Rothbard talks about the origins of central banking systems. And I think one of the major takeaways is these things fail. Like it's like a 200-year track record of people trying to pull basically the same scam over and over again. It constantly collapses, and it really took until like the Bank of England is like the only one extant from like 200 years prior, and then the Federal Reserve now. And there was one story that he told where there was this bank in New England. This was in the I think this was like right after the Civil War, perhaps shortly before it. There's one bank in New England that kept a reserve ratio like slightly higher than all the other banks in the area. And over the course of like 5 or 10 years, it accumulated enough banknotes to threaten to run on every bank simultaneously, and made itself just through its own slight judiciousness, the Reserve Bank of all of New England. So when you read that book, you just see this constant pattern of all of these banks, it's like Boromir with the ring. It's like, throw it away. It's like, I could use it. It could be me, I could be the one to lend out my reserves and then, suspend specie payments. There was one story. Oh, here's one on the free banking question. So this is for those of you who are, again, who've been to Mises U, or those of you who are, again, more economically aware, you might know that there's sort of a controversy in the Austrian school among Austrian economists operating in good faith, a real disagreement that is not, a proxy for some other kind of like weird social view, which is the question of whether or not fractional reserve banking could exist in the free market. And so the free bankers, these are people like Larry White, George Selgin. Is Pete Becky a free banker? I have to imagine that he is. A lot of George Mason people. are all on this free banking idea, and you should read Mystery Banking to because Rothbard gives both sides. Because in chapter 9, I believe, Rothbard goes at length, extolling the virtues of Larry White's great paper on how the Bank of England was this evil, centralized banking fractional reserve, not quite a Ponzi scheme, more of a what would you call it? I guess it is a pyramid scheme, right? Because if everybody takes their money, yeah, you're paying previous. Yeah, it is a pyramid scheme, And then he compares it to Scottish free banking and how they were at nearly 100% specie, but not quite. And then they were constantly checking their books. And what Rothbard finds out later, after he's already written the book, he does his own research on it, and he says, like, actually, I take back everything I said because the Bank of Scotland was constantly trying every trick within the bounds of the law to stop people from withdrawing their funds, especially from withdrawing their funds in terms of the actual gold. So they would use police to harass people. They had certain laws written where you had to testify that you were not working for another bank. They would really just, imagine the guys from Peak, you go to the bank and you're like, I'd like to make a withdrawal, and they give you banknotes, and you say, oh, no, I'd like my silver coins back. And then the guys from Peaky Blinders show up and they're like, you'll get your silver, lady, but we have some questions to ask you first. Why do you need the silver? Don't you trust us? These kinds of shenanigans.
When it comes to reclaiming the American right, this is the Justin Raimondo book, right?
Yep.
Awesome. Fill me in. This was actually the book that Scott Horton gave to Will Chamberlain, a man who was a right-wing Zionist, before he debated him on the Tim Pool show. So Scott Horton has endorsed this. I've yet to
He gave him the book and then debated him?
Yeah. He describes why he's doing it. He goes, the right is not inherently pro-war. You don't have to be pushing for every war against all of Israel's enemies. So reclaiming the American right. What is the big takeaway you had from this book?
That the Republican Party has more real life institutional and personnel connections with the Communist Party of 100 years ago than the Democrat Party does. I remember this was many years ago when I was running the Yale chapter at Mason, and I was going to do 2 presentations. It was sort of how I knew about the neocon Trotskyite connection for the Republicans, and I said I'll do one in parallel on the Democratic Party and their communist connections. And what you find if you look at people who actually hold office in the Democratic Party is that there's really nothing. There's very few. You have the squad. So you have AOC, who is a creature of the YDSA. Back in the Roosevelt administration, you had people like Harry Dexter White or Henry Morgenthau. You had those guys who had Communist Party sympathies. But if you're just walking around, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, the party of Bill Clinton doesn't really have too many, former student radicals in it. You think about, John Kerry was not even in any communist organizations, even though he was in the 1960s anti-war movement. So there's really nothing there. There's a very tenuous one where Barack Obama was affiliated with, I keep calling him Bill Weathers sometimes, Bill Ayers of the Weathermen. But if you see, that was because Bill Ayers got involved in, Chicago Democrat Party politics, and he was doing something with their teachers union. And it was only at that phase that Barack Obama became affiliated with him. And it's not really a strong affiliation. The Republicans made a very big deal. For those of you who are too young, the Republicans made a huge deal about this in 2008. So the Republicans actually have a much stronger connection, although the point of entry was a Democrat. So what happened was Albert Volsetter, who was a Trotskyite, got involved with the War Production Board during World War II. And that was how he, as with it was Albert Volsetter and Simon Kuznets, who I think those of you who are economists know the Kuznets curve. They involved the War Production Board. They got involved with, the Democratic Party's War Hawk wing, and sort of the Southern Democrat Cold Warrior culture. So the Scoop Jackson Democrats, those included Richard Pearl and Paul Wolfowitz, and that was how the second generation of Trotskyites got into first, the congressional bureaucracy, and then they became Republicans.
So is this overlap the result of I guess Sol would call it the unconstrained vision. So if you have the communists of Vladimir Lenin saying that the problem is not institutions, it's not incentives, it's we could fix the human race by basically doing mathematics to resolve our economics issues and make certain laws. Whereas the constrained view would say humans are constantly fallible, universally self interested. We need institutions that reflect those. Whereas the leftist says, no, these are problems which can be solved. The neocon doesn't say, well, there's constraints and benefits with these foreign interventions. They say Putin is bad and needs to be taken out. Doesn't matter that Zelensky's more anti-democratic than Putin. The fight for democracy will be against Putin for Zelensky. We got to take Saddam out, and this way democracy can reign free in the region. Of course, led to the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria.
Yeah.
Credit to Max Boot for actually conceding that point. So it seems like the neocons and the communists, they use very different talking points generally, but it seems like they both share the unconstrained view, whereas the constrained view is the reason that Pat Buchanan, Murray Rothbard, and Lou Rockwell all got along so well, even with people like Hans Hoppe. That's what they share, as far as I know. I haven't read the book, but that's just what comes to mind. Anything you think that
we're still talking about reclaiming, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, this constraint, unconstrained view, I normally hear it in the context of, economics and maybe some amount of social planning. I never really heard it applied to, international relations and foreign policy. It is broadly applicable, although I wouldn't say that is the primary issue for them. I would say, we know what the primary issue is for them. Beyond this, there is a certain kind of, let's call it, zealousness combined with fearfulness. This idea that if you don't have your hands on everything, that things will change. It's not that they believe that the U.S. government is like the primary agent of change. Actually, there's so many agents of change in the world. They actually do believe, people do have their motivations, and if I don't know what they are, they're probably bad. They're just a hop, skip, and a step away from
and bad motivations necessarily mean bad outcomes. So the fact that the private sector is engaged in profit seeking, that is really bad.
Yeah.
That is the worldview. It doesn't matter what the results are. Jeff Bezos has drastically increased people's ability to access tons of products and services. The poorest people, doesn't matter. He's in it for profit himself. So
yeah, I think one of the best modern examples of how this kind of paranoia and neuroticism and vindictiveness comes into play in politics is, Trump was making some very strange remarks about Nayib Bukele. And the reason for, I think of a variety of reasons for, but one of the main plausible ones I've heard is that Bukele has been taking a lot of money from China and trying to give El Salvador an economy that is not, based primarily on remittances from the United States. And, this prospect of violating the Monroe Doctrine, not even with a Chinese military base, but simply the idea that there's a country out there which is resistant to U.S. sanctions, even if El Salvador isn't, annexing Guatemala right now. In theory, it might have the kind of economy that maybe could force an Anschluss of Costa Rica. And just that in principle, it just is intolerable.
Excellent point. Two more, and then we'll get to the meat of this discussion. Age of Entitlement. Have not read this one. What are the main lessons you learned from this one?
So Age of Entitlement is, Caldwell is actually from Claremont, which is, in all the circumstances, kind of a neoconservative think tank, actually. But it tells a story of, Civil Rights Act, the sexual revolution, and the anti-Vietnam War protest movement. And I think one of the things that I hadn't thought about until I'd read it was that people, when they look back, they say to themselves, we were in the streets for civil rights, we were in the streets against the war, and these were two, liberal struggles. But if you properly understand what, the civil rights movement was, as a sort of, this top-down reorientation of American race relations, even, Lyndon Johnson was not against civil rights. This idea of, the civil rights protests as a challenge to federal power. I mean, it wasn't when it was happening. The national government was completely in favor of it. From 19 1963 to 1969, I mean, we had just pro civil rights federal government. The only protest, or the protests were there, to get southern states to get on with the program. And so Lyndon Johnson considered the Vietnam War like a social program. And Rothbard talks about this idea of the welfare warfare state, of this idea. Johnson had these quotes. Johnson and Kissinger actually both had quotes along the lines of, we had to lie about the cost of the Vietnam War and constantly understate what it was, because if we overstated it, then Congress might balk at spending another few, tens of millions of dollars on social programs. Like, when it came to the two of them, Johnson was actually willing to lie about one to protect the other. So this welfare warfare state idea, this idea of what we see now, where America sort of bribes, or used to, build dams or build irrigation projects in Afghanistan, and then, try to pay the Taliban not to attack it. This idea of trying to Marshall plan a country before the war is even over. America was doing this in Vietnam too. It was called, the Mekong Delta Renewal Project or something along these lines. But the military as a tool of social policy is a theme that a lot of people who are libertarians especially will get from it.
Yes, I remember Robert Caro writing in LBJ's big biography, something to the extent of, we could have created a Tennessee Valley Authority in Vietnam. So all of this was to help you guys. I'm sorry about the 3.7 million deaths. You shouldn't have resisted. I'm sorry, please. And then, so not only did they lie and undersell it, if you read Robert McNamara's book titled Argument Without End, he met the leaders of North Vietnam, the generals, in 1995 in Paris and in Vietnam to go over, hey, what was the problem 30 years ago? And Argument Without End is the book where he goes through all of this. And you actually read McNamara finding out that on August 4th, 1964, he goes, well, we think there might have been an attack that we're almost certain there was 2 days before. And he goes, there was no attack. And he goes, looking back, it doesn't look like there was attack. There were certainly no casualties in the Gulf of Tonkin. And then he goes, even more surprising, the order on the second day to shoot the Maddox was not given by Hanoi, but some local commander who didn't have authorization to do something. McNamara says that in and of itself could have avoided the Vietnam War. I don't know how true that is. I think the whatever deep state at the time, the Curtis LeMays, were pushing it so hard that McNamara would have just been assassinated before he could, be a real bulwark against the growth of the state there. But yeah, reading those things, LBJ was just as bad, and the whole thing was, we're helping these poor, vulnerable people. Do you have anything on that?
Yeah, it's a bunch of things flew through my head just now, and it's fiercely typed before I forgot them. Another great thing that you get out of Age of Entitlement is this great use of polling data, where he shows you what were people thinking at this time. So one that really annoyed me when I read it was his polling data on it was the Christmas bombing of Hanoi, where he showed how something like 70% of Americans agreed that the war was unwinnable, and something like 60% they answer the question, which is would you agree to the end of the war if the North Vietnamese are willing to make, and the word was any concession whatsoever. In other words, would you be willing to agree to a peace with Vietnam if they can just if they gave you a quarter as a consolation prize? Would you agree to a peace with them? And a super majority of Americans were yes. We can't win. We would make peace at a moment's notice. We would let the UN do it. We would let anyone do it. They were all completely we want this war to stop. And then it's how would you feel about an upcoming offensive to saturation bomb North Vietnam and factories in their capital, and and put naval mines in their harbor? And again, it's majority yes. It's so you agree that you can't win the war? You agree that you want the war to stop? You agree that you would agree to any terms that they would offer you, but you want to bomb them anyway, just for what? Just to soothe your ego? You know,
Yeah. It certainly seems like the bombing campaigns did more to unite the Vietnamese, and I get this from the generals having the discussions with McNamara in this book, Argument Without End. But it's amazing that people said, well, even for a quarter, the smallest thing, we should take it as a victory and come home. Because Kissinger in 2011 was interviewed by Niall Ferguson, and he said, here were Hanoi's demands: complete unconditional withdrawal of American troops. And that, of course, is not something we could entertain. That was literally the offer. Just withdraw the troops and we can have this settlement. They really wanted, the Viet Cong in the South to probably unify the peninsula under communism, which is fucking evil and unexcusable. But my God, a near genocide to stop it from happening. And it happened anyway. So,
and then after, at the end of all that, the Vietnamese government, after uniting, you know, the party it's basically had the same China transformation within like 15 years.
Yeah, exactly. Shout out to Deng Xiaoping if you're listening from heaven.
Yeah, if you're listening from Samsara, let us know.
Put a Y in the chat. Okay, one other book you've talked a lot about is Why Nations Fail. Or frankly, I don't remember if we talked about it last time, but when I go to your excellent Twitter account, which I always love following, it is the book in the background here. What did you learn from Why Nations Fail?
So, Why Nations Fail is a pretty introductory development economics book. I won't say it's not the first, but it was part of a new generation of institutionalist ones. When you are a first-year grad student, what they give you is this paper by the same authors, Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robertson, and it's called The Colonial Origins of Comparative Development. And that book lays out, the same thing, but in longer form for a more popular audience. And it sets this dichotomy between inclusive versus extractive institutions. So the idea that it goes with is something like this. There are some places that Europeans colonized, and when you get there, the bugs, the water, the rocks, and the trees are all trying to kill you. And so you set up basically smash and grab institutions. You set up the kinds of laws that are, you're not thinking about protecting property rights. You're not really thinking about, staying there for the long haul. So everything is just there to be conducive to extracting, primary resources. All of the roads are pointed at the coast and so on and so forth. On the other hand, if you have a place like, strangely, Australia, even though I don't think of that as being, I'm already thinking of like how to debunk this book. We think about this constantly. But places like Australia, which are apparently hyper fertile, welcoming zones. But I guess since you have to live there anyway, so you have to make it something that's livable. Or places like North America, then you make institutions that are called inclusive. So you want to entice settlers to move there. Nobody's going to voluntarily move to North America if you say, like, by the way, in North America, we're just running like the slave mines of Dromedon, you're going to bring the family along. You set up institutions that are, almost Smithian, right? Peace, easy taxes, tolerable administration of justice. And so that is the dichotomy there. It's a sort of path dependency type argument where, Angola's fate was sealed, 150 years ago when the first Portuguese, when the first Portuguese got there, started getting mosquito bites, and they said, all right, let's give them the bad law package instead of the good law package.
So basically, this is institutional theory in response to, I guess, genetic determinism, which is he's attempting to explain why.
I guess all institutional economics is sort of an implicit attack on genetic determinism. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So this would be like the explanation for why East and West Germany had different levels of wealth, why North and South Korea do, why Zimbabwe and Botswana do. Is that the main takeaway? That
it doesn't
all
even try
else
to...
equal, better institutions involve more freedom and more social cooperation?
That is an implicit, that is a takeaway of institutional economics, but that's not what the book is about. Like, the book doesn't even try, Zimbabwe versus Botswana, although, you can just kind of infer that.
I think I'm mixing that up with another book. I apologize. All right. So let's get into my favorite history book of
Mhm.
all time. Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War. When it comes to the term unnecessary war, the thing that jumps out is the war against National Socialism was unnecessary. How dare you?
Yeah.
What is your first response to that?
National Socialism was putting itself in a pitched battle. Like, you had a situation with the two most opaque, most violent dictatorships, right next to each other, both of them chomping at the bit to go to war with the other. And somehow the British made it so that they attacked France first. One way or another, those two powers went to war. And at the end of that, National Socialism failed. You would think, at the very least, if we could have just changed anything else back in time, could we have saved France 4 years of trouble by changing the order of those struggles? People have this idea. It's like, well, they would have won that war and then gone on and fought a second one. How often does it happen that you fight one like 4 year, existential slugfest, and at the end of it, you're like, wow, I am now ready to go to war with the largest land army in Europe, which would have been at the time France. It's a very strange idea people have. The only reason Germany could go to wars against three regional powers back to back to back was because the French collapsed so quickly. But
in the French defense, they had just lost 1.3 million servicemen and civilians in the previous war 20 years earlier. So the people alive saw the carnage and actually knew it. It's not like us talking about Lincoln's War or anything.
Yeah.
And
one thing that
that's
that didn't even click to me until the end of the book was how the Germans weren't even really planning to occupy France for that long because they expected the British to peace out. When they wrote the armistice terms on France, where they occupied something like 60% of the country's landmass, and this rump regime in Vichy that only touched the south coast. Like, if you look at the map of German occupied France and the Vichy France, and you see that the Germans drew the map specifically so that the Vichy government would not have access to the Atlantic. They were not planning on holding on to that for so long. The assumption for the Germans, and likewise, when Pétain agreed to this, he was under the assumption we're just going to be sitting here in Vichy for maybe a month or two until the British come to the table, and we'll get our country back. We'll probably lose Alsatia. Maybe we'll lose something in Belgium or something, but we'll all be back in Paris, by the end of the year. And then Churchill starts getting on stage talking about, our victory at any cost, on the beaches, in the mountains, on the landing strips, in the seas. And suddenly the French are like, wait, are the Germans still here? It's 1942. Why are there still Germans in Paris? It's like, well, we thought you would have pieced out by now.
And I believe France was part of Neville Chamberlain's September 3rd declaration of war against Germany. So it was their government who officially declared the war against the National Socialists. Are you of the opinion that Hitler almost certainly wanted war against Judeo-Bolshevism in Russia, but really just saw the British and the Americans and French as potential allies in the long run?
Yeah, well, he definitely wanted to be at peace with Britain. Hitler doesn't really have that many statements on what his stance is on the French. Although it is notable that Hitler was Austrian and not Prussian. Buchanan talks about this, how Hitler's racial views are almost completely disjointed from those of the rest of Germany, because he has a really strong racialized distaste for Czechs, for example, but almost no distaste for Poles. But if you looked at the German government of 1914 to 1917, you would have seen there, among that Prussian leadership, a racialized empathy for Poles, and then sort of neutral to nothing feelings on Czechs, because Czechs at that time are, an interior population of Austria-Hungary.
Yeah.
But when it came to France, Hitler didn't have any, or to French people anyway, to my understanding, Hitler didn't have strong views one way or another on them.
One of the first very interesting thing about Buchanan's book is he does mention that it was Great Britain that actually declared war. And that is usually met with, okay, technically they declared it, but the National Socialists are being so provocative with their invasions that you still have to pin everything on them. There is a book that Buchanan cites by Principal Assistant Secretary of Air Ministry J.M. Spate. Spate says this in 1944 in a book titled Bombing Vindicated. Dresden was in 45. He says, on page 46, Spate says, in May 1940, Churchill sent the first bombers against the German civilian population. Later, he goes on to say, we have shrunk from giving our great decision of May 1940 the publicity which it deserves. That surely was a mistake. It was a splendid decision. It was as heroic, as self-sacrificing as Russia's decision to adopt her policy of scorched earth. It could have harmed us morally, only if it were equivalent to an admission that we were the first to bomb towns. The German Blitz took place in September of 1940. So for the first few months of this war, the Germans are getting bombed by the British after the British had declared war. This was just so mind-blowing to me that I read it from like 6 different, there's Max Hastings, Charles Percy Snow, and then Arthur Harris, Bomber Harris, in his book Bomber Command, I think, or Bomber Offensive.
Yeah, I'm also of the view
I could not believe this. I could not believe this. So
I'm
please
also
either
of the view, I
comment
will
on
admit
that.
that you know, when it comes like, oh well, you know, technically Britain declared war first, I'm like, doesn't matter, right? Because at that point when you're like exchanging ultimatums, you know, if one side says like, you know, we're on it, it's like, okay, well then what's there to talk about? Like the British give a war guarantee, the Germans call the bluff, the British cash in on it. It's like, okay, I mean, what? But the thing about, you know, the civilian bombings first, that also did, you know, floor me when I really came to comprehend that. And there's this running quality when you read Churchill Hitler that it's always funny calling this book Churchill Hitler. It's just, but that Winston Churchill, it's like two groups, you know, those old Justice League is like, you know, meanwhile in the Hall of Justice, meanwhile the Legion of Doom, but it's just two, like, meanwhile the Legion of Doom, meanwhile the other Legion of Doom, because Churchill's constantly coming up with these harebrained schemes. He's like coming up as like, gentlemen, my new plan is homelessness. What? Yeah. Yes, my new plan is to render 1/3 of the German population homeless. Studies have shown that homelessness is actually more damaging to morale than even the death of a loved one. So our plan is homelessness. You're like, what? Why would you? Why would you think of this? And then during the D-Day one, I don't know if you remember this one. During D-Day, he's like, okay, so the British, the French, or the British, the Polish forces, the Americans, we've all just made landfall in Normandy. The Germans are being routed. We're about to make a breakthrough. I think we should drop anthrax on Germany. You know, he's just constantly having these like deranged plans, even when other parties, and this is another one, the Soviets didn't do city terror bombing. You could say they didn't need to because the British were doing it for them. But this is something, I think it was Norman Finkelstein who pointed this out. He was trying to push a kind of a different agenda there, but he was pointing out there's no cities in Eastern Europe where, you know, the Soviets hadn't made it that far on the line and they were just bombing it just because. You know, it was only the British who were engaging in this policy, like, let's bomb a city we're not even close to, just to terrorize the population, render them homeless. The Soviets did do siege bombardment. They committed plenty of crimes, you know, on their own terms. But all of these crimes were usually committed after by definition, after they'd already taken the city, right? Or in the process of taking the city. And this is something that even applies to Russian doctrine now, where during the Chechen War, the Russians had destroyed like 80% of the city of Grozny, but they were doing it in the course of like taking the city. It wasn't as though it takes a very special kind of country, a special kind of government to decide like, we don't have any intention of taking the city or degrading the military that is guarding. We're just bombing it to render the population homeless just because. That's, you know, it's a very special kind of hostile mindset, you know?
It's certainly evil. So if you hear Goebbels giving his final speech saying it's something to the extent of, this is going to be our finest hour, just as the Roman Empire was not defeated in its early wars, we're going to win this thing. And in the background, he's in Berlin. You can actually hear the bombs. Was that would that have been the Soviets or the British if it was in Berlin?
In that case, depending on when he gave the speech, that would be the Soviets bombarding the city as they're trying to enter it.
Okay, so that would have
Yeah,
been
siege
February
bombardment.
of
Not morally, but
45.
siege
Yeah.
bombardment and terror bombing are just practically two different things.
Okay. And one thing on homelessness. So Charles Percy Snow, Encyclopedia Britannica says he's a scientific advisor to the British government during the Second World War. He gave a series of lectures at Harvard University in 1961 titled Science and Government, where he says that there was a paper by Frederick Lindemann, the science advisor to Churchill, and he summarizes the paper. The paper claimed that given a total concentration of effort on the production and use of bombing aircraft, it would be possible in all larger towns of Germany, that is, those with more than 50,000 inhabitants, to destroy 50% of all houses. It's amazing how these people actually do go into it when they feel like they're just talking to their, policy friends, and they're not giving Churchill's Iron Curtain speech or anything. But that was just so unbelievable to read, because it's like, how did they actually do they talk about this? It did not seem real when Buchanan was describing it, but these quotes that Buchanan uses from people who had to be in a position to know was just absolutely unreal. Um, there was so much in this book. It's just clogging my mind right now. Okay, so one thing on the war guarantee to Poland. I think this was so clearly just Germany is becoming a bigger empire, and we need to take them on. The British need to be calling the shots. We'll give Poland a war guarantee against National Socialism, because a real war guarantee would have meant that on September 17th, the British would have declared war against the Soviets when they invaded Poland. So it seems like, even if you're like, well, we were preserving their integrity, even that, not to mention that Stalin just rips up the Yalta agreements and doesn't
At the
hold
end of the
Polish elections.
I mean, that's something everybody needs to really, and it's one of those things, like, you say it, and Americans almost treat it like some kind of weird dramatic irony. It's like a plot twist in the play, and like, oh well. But none of these countries were free in the end, right? Like, at the end of all of it, Poland, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, all Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, all of these countries, every single one of them, I mean, there was not everything east of the Oder River was controlled by like a genocidal dictatorship, no matter what. Like, that was the outcome. And it really, when you say it, I mean, especially when it comes to people who are like on the right, and you really need to like shake it in their heads, like, you have this idea that Stalin is evil, but you realize for them it's sort of episodic. Like, Stalin did the Holodomor, and that was bad, and then he did the Great Purge, and that was bad. But they seem to think that it's like Stalin has like an evil level where it kind of goes like,
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
exactly.
Like, it spikes up and like, no, it's just bad the whole time. It's a terror state the whole time.
Well, Stalin, we can definitely form an alliance with, but Putin, we can't even talk to Putin. Putin's done bad things in Ukraine. After the Holodomor, they allied with Stalin.
And not to mention this, but if you're standing there on September of 1939, if you're just looking at the decisions as they were made, notwithstanding post-war discoveries, you would see, actually, even in 1939, there simply was no Holocaust in the 30s. It didn't start until 1941. So if you're just standing there, Stalin has a body count is he in the double-digit millions yet? I don't think he's yet reached the tens of millions, but he's definitely something in like the 8 or 9 million range. And so if you're just looking at that, and then between Germany and Poland, I mean, these are two like anti-Semitic dictatorships. Like, the reason why Kristallnacht even occurred, I think people don't realize this, was because Germany was, and this is also, some people should know about the Holocaust, broadly speaking, like, what did Germans think was happening, is that when Germany was deporting the Jews, the first Jews it was deporting were Jews with citizenship in countries that were not Germany because of Versailles. So Germany used to encompass large parts of Poland. So there were a lot of Jews with Polish citizenship who were nonetheless located in Germany because of the holdovers of the German Empire. And so the Reich said, well, hold on, we're going to deport all the Jews with Polish citizenship, any Jews with Czech citizenship, any Jews with, if there's a new country that's been made after 1919 and you're a citizen of that country and you're Jewish, you're leaving. And what the Polish government said at the time was like, oh, that's on the table. We can just strip Jews of citizenship. So they basically did it too. Like they saw, a deluge of 180,000 Polish Jews on the way. It's like, actually, we take it back. Give me your passport. You're not a citizen of anywhere. So you have all these Jews that are rendered stateless. They're living as refugees in France. So and one of these refugees goes to the German embassy in Paris and shoots the ambassador. So you're looking at anti-Semitic dictatorship number 1 versus anti-Semitic dictatorship number 2, and then at the end of it, you ally with it's like two like Germany and Poland is like two racist dictatorships fighting, and then like behind them is like the most murderous dictatorship the world has ever seen in its history up to that point. And you're like, I'm gonna side with that guy. Like I feel like he's the real hero of this story.
Yeah, and if invading countries is what made the National Socialists so bad, Sean McMeekin in his book Stalin's War explains
another fantastic book everybody should read.
He goes, well, it's worth mentioning Stalin committed atrocities in Ukraine and invaded Finland and Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia and set up regimes there. Why weren't we more worried about him taking over the world, considering the explicit goal of Comintern, Third International, Communist International, was to literally take over the world. Proletarians of the world unite, as Marx said in 1848. So my takeaway with this is that instead, we just need different heroes. I'm sick of Churchill being a hero. I'm sick of just everyone is the next Hitler. As far as who's next on the hit list, whether it's David Koresh, Saddam Hussein, Bashar al-Assad. The Trump spokesman said Bashar al-Assad is worse than Hitler because of his gas attack, the second fake one under Trump in like 2018. I am just so sick of those. So one more thing we got to go over is John F. Kennedy's take on Munich. John F. Kennedy wrote Why England Slept in July of 1940. I want to say this was his doctoral thesis. Here's JFK steelmanning the reason why you can never appease appeasement. That's for people like Marcel. We got to stand tall like people like Churchill. Munich should teach us that we must realize that any bluff will be called. We cannot tell anyone to keep out of our hemisphere unless our armaments and the people behind these armaments are prepared to back up the command, even to the ultimate point of going to war. There must be no doubt in anyone's mind. The decision must be automatic. If we debate, if we hesitate, if we question, it will be too late. What is the true story of Munich, or what is omitted from the Munich never appease narrative?
Munich was something like 98% German. The Czech government under Beneš was basically creating like an apartheid state. I mean, they were systematically. I'm sorry. 1 sec. We're talking about the meeting at Munich discussing Munich or Sudetenland. The Munich conference is of the Sudetenland, unless we have two separate questions that we're trying to get to here.
You know what? Okay, I missed that. I missed that in the analysis. Sorry.
Which event were you trying to talk about? Austria, the Answers of Austria, the Danziger War,
Sudetenland.
Right. Yes.
Okay. Yes. Thank you. I'm sorry.
I lost a part of the question. So then, what was the true story of Munich? Is what you're asking?
Yes.
Yes. So the Munich was Jesus Christ. Now I'm saying it now. The Sudetenland, which is what was discussed at Munich. The Sudetenland was a territory that was 98% or something 95% ethnically German. The Czechs had created, America has actually kind of a similar situation technically in its laws, which is anything within like a 5 mile or 10 mile distance from the border has like a reduced requirements for Fourth Amendment searches. I don't know if you guys know this, but America has this. But in Czechoslovakia, Beneš had created like a similar like 5 kilometer strip that hugs the entire border, which basically meant that something like 49, 51% of its of the entire population of the country was effectively under martial law. The German population was being, systematically stripped of its property. They were being removed from all their government positions. And this was happening even during like the Weimar period. And that was something I'd read on I forget which book it was talking about this, how the Czech government was saying that, you know, any German marching band, backpacking club, sports association, all of these are, you know, really German spy rings, and so they're all just, you know, systematically banned. And I try to give people the benefit of the doubt, you know. So I said to myself, like, okay, you know, maybe the German marching band in today, maybe that was like a German spy ring. But then I saw the year that it happened. It's like 1922. I'm like, never mind. You're not going to tell me. You know what I mean? It's like, if you want to tell me that you know, the NSDAP and Goebbels has some crazy harebrained schemes or whatever, fine. I might be willing to accept that premise, actually. But if you're telling me that you're concerned that in 1922, during a hyperinflation, that you're telling me that the Weimar German government is trying to have a secret coup of like Boy Scouts? No, I don't believe you. Like, you're just finding excuses to dispossess these people, to take their property. You know, Pat Buchanan actually understates it in the book. He talks about oh man, what do you call it? Like accounting tricks or census tricks. I forget what he calls it. But basically what the Czech government was doing was like it would put towns under martial law, and then it would count the garrison as residents of the town, conduct a census, and then say this town is like 51% Czech because there'd be more soldiers than men in it, or more soldiers than civilians in it. So this is a Czech village. And so all of these kinds of
just like the point you made earlier, the Sudetenland, I remember doing the numbers. I think it's 1/5 of what was Czechoslovakia in 1938. So this was worth declaring war over, apparently, in retrospect. But not just the Sudetenland, but all of Czechoslovakia was occupied by the Bolsheviks after the mass murder campaign of the Second World War. So I guess never clarified.
Yeah, although actually, I mean, Munich, you know, Bennis points us out. Bennis himself said it, that technically Munich, like that agreement, saved Czechoslovakia, because what is the capital of Czechoslovakia? I've already forgotten it now. Oh, well, whatever it was the only capital city in Europe that wasn't bombed. Like, compared to all the other countries, you know, by surrendering without a fight and then just getting liberated later, they're the only ones to not have, you know, this huge bombing campaign over their country.
So
Prague.
even in 1918, it says Prague. I know that Czech Republic is today, but Czechoslovakia was only created in 1918, so I bet it was back then.
Yeah, it was Prague, and then Bratislava is the capital of Slovakia now.
Okay. Another thing that Buchanan points out, which was just brilliant, going through sort of this, there's like a Churchill biography within this book, and he talks about how, as First Lord of the Admiralty, Churchill convinces Henry Asquith to form a naval blockade around Germany, starving the civilian population. And Martin Gilbert, a very pro-Churchill historian, his estimate in a book titled The First World War, A Complete History, is 762,000 civilian deaths in Germany as a causal result of Churchill's blockade when he was First Lord of the Admiralty. Just a crime like this. We're so terrified of a potential decrease in trade with Taiwan if China goes in and makes some effect. It's like, this was a complete civilian blockade. And
it needs to emphasize also how unprecedented this was at the time. Yeah. Now, this is sort of taken as just a part of how America conducts wars because of World War II. But back then, again, you have to imagine it's really Churchill just coming up constantly with the evil plan. Everybody's like trying to figure, like, okay, you know, how, you know, everybody's coming up with like, okay, we need to break through the German lines here or something. And Churchill's like, what if we just starve them? Like, what if we just drop anthrax on the farms? You know, what if we start making everybody homeless? And it's like, Churchill, what are you doing right now? Like, what is in you that is making you come up with these absolutely, I mean, everybody needs to understand this. These are insane plans. These are insane, murderous plans. Churchill is constantly, seemingly every month, in every war he's in, he's coming up with some new and novel ways. Like, how can I terrorize the civilian population? How can I starve them to death? Can I poison them? You know, can I put saltpeter in their food? What can I do to make, I mean, imagine it D-Day. Really imagine that scene in Saving Private Ryan. They're charging up the beach. You're at, like, you know, America's, you know, our finest hour right? Patton's made, or Eisenhower, whoever made that great speech. Everybody's charging. Your real honorable warfare. Honorable warfare hours. And Churchill's just sitting in the back, like, how can I take this and just really, this plan is not evil. It's like Churchill's sitting there, he's seeing D-Day, he's seeing the naval invasion, he's looking at this, and he's like, wow, you guys are really about to liberate France with this giant naval invasion. You're just going to charge up the hill and storm the bunkers. You're going to shoot these Nazis. You're going to punch Hitler in the face. We're going to be marching through Paris. Everybody's going to be cheering us along. And he's just thinking to himself, like, this needs a little something extra. I think it needs like weapons of mass destruction. Yeah. I think this plan, D-Day is going too well. You know what I mean? This is look too good. I feel like when this happened, 50 years from now, when we make a movie about D-Day, they're not going to need to like hide anything because it seems like everybody's acting on the up and up. So we need to do something to really make this dirty.
Yeah.
We need biological weapons. That's what he needs.
Yeah, well, so Sir Arthur Harris wrote Bomber Offensive, and in there he says, with regard to the Dresden decision, all I will say is that decision was made by people far more important than myself. Harris is running the Air Force at the time, so it sounds like Churchill. If you read I want to say it's the 6th book of Churchill's Second World War memoirs, he says, so I asked Uncle Joe what he thought about what we'd have to do in Dresden, and he said something like the same thing we'd have to do in Gomorrah or something. I actually want to get that quote just because I thought this was...
I don't remember that one, because I remember there were exchanges where Churchill would tell Stalin something, and Stalin would be like, that's an interesting idea. Like, that's a start, things like that. And I always did wonder, what it's like to be Joseph Stalin, where, you yourself also, that Stalin have perpetrated so many atrocities. Well, all of your atrocities, there's like a point to them in a certain way where, back in 1918, Leon Trotsky, he took St. Petersburg and made it Leningrad. And back then, he basically set up the entire Communist Party there. I'm going to need to put in my own guy, just to replace it. So I'll have to keep an eye on things. Then that guy gets shot, and you're like, okay, so the entire Leningrad Communist Party is about to get, all expenses paid vacations to the East. That terror, there's like a clear cause and effect line there. I'm not saying this was justified, but there's a causal line there. Meanwhile, Churchill is like, Stalin, I've been thinking, you guys are about to do a major offensive in the East these days, right? And he's like, yeah, okay. Now, we don't want the Germans to mount a counteroffensive, so we thought of an idea how to help you. I'm like, okay, what's your idea? We're going to incinerate Danzig, and then the flood of refugees will clog up all the highways so that the Germans won't be able to reinforce the line. And you have to imagine Stalin like, you're going, what? And then Churchill's like, wait, we decided, upon further conference, we've decided that this plan was not, it lacked a certain pizzazz. So what we're going to do is going to bomb it a second time in the morning to get all the firefighters and the ambulances. This is the...
My God.
Imagine you're telling Stalin this. Imagine Stalin's kind of like, what kind of, what is going on in England? What are they doing?
Okay, so here is Arthur Harris in his book Bomber Offensive. I know that the destruction of so large and splendid a city at this late stage of the war was considered unnecessary, even by a good many people who admit that our earlier attacks were as fully justified as any other operation of the war. Here I will only say that the attack on Dresden was at the time considered a military necessity by much more important people than myself. Here is Churchill in Triumph and Tragedy, the 6th volume. At 3 o'clock on February 4th, the day after our arrival, Stalin called on me, and we had an agreeable discussion about the war against Germany. He was optimistic. Germany was short of bread and coal. Her transport was seriously damaged. I asked what the Russians would do if Hitler moved south, to Dresden, for example. We shall follow him, was the reply. I couldn't find much more of a discussion, and it does not there's not evidence that the Soviets were behind Dresden. It was American and Royal Air Force bombers. So when I look at these books and compare the narratives, it seems like Churchill was definitely the one who authorized this.
Yeah, and when you do more, I'm trying a good second. Stalin's War actually will be good on this, but I was talking about Stalin having like a nice, consistently high level of evil. There's no aberrant spikes, and Stalin's World War II conduct is like a perfect demonstration of it. In that Stalin is the person who he wants to win the war and come out politically better at the end than at the beginning. And again, yeah. Soviet Union has its own fair share of crimes, but you look at, for example, a lot of Germans, as the walls were closing in, they were saying to themselves, "Oh, we don't want to surrender to this Bolshevik terror state because we know they have this gulag system and Stalin's been starving people. So what we're going to do is we're going to fight to go surrender to the West and see if we get better treatment under Eisenhower." And it's that won't work, And if you go by the numbers, you had a higher survival rate of German POWs who surrendered at Stalingrad, went to the Gulag, and they were kept there until 1955. Right? They had a higher, so Stalingrad is in 1942, 1943. This has to be 1943, right? Stalingrad, 1943, 12 years in Stalin's gulags as a German soldier. You are more likely to survive there than in Eisenhower's Rhine River camps in between 1945 and 1948. So Stalin, he's just here to win wars. And you can almost see the logic of it, where, all the other people, all the innocent people Stalin kills, he's thinking these people might be the seeds of a revolution against me. These people could be anywhere. They could be anyone. There could be around any corner. And I need to make sure that my power is consolidated. And for him, he's well, a bunch of German soldiers aren't really a political threat to me. What are the Germans going to do? They're going to walk around, tell people oh, we should revolt against Stalin. He'd be die Nazi. So he's not
in the same way that slave owners would make sure their slaves got food. It's not are you saying they're good people? It's no, that was just the most profitable avenue at the time for them.
And so this is another one that people need to get. Everybody, just if you were a German soldier, you would have been better off in the Gulag under Stalin for 12 years than 3 years in Allied imprisonment. Your odds of living were higher. Just everybody needs to chew on that when they think. I'm not, again, Joseph Stalin. We can spend a whole other hour, Keith, discussing all of it. And you should all read Stalin's War, a fantastic book by Sean McMeekin, which goes through the litany of atrocities. Another great book on this is Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder. If you want to see, some Soviet atrocities and German atrocities that will make your stomach turn, Bloodlands is the one. Stalin's War has some great ones too,
and Goebbels' diaries are just unbelievable. He has one from, I want to say it's March of 42, where he's I just got to find that one real quick because it's just so unbelievable. March 26th, 1942. Beginning with Lublin, the Jews in general government are now being evacuated eastward. The procedure is pretty barbaric. One, and not to be described here more definitely, not much will remain of the Jews. On the whole, it can be said that about 60% of them will have to be liquidated, whereas only 40% can be used for forced labor. My point is not to defend Soviets or National Socialism. I hate them even more, just as much, whatever, we're comparing infinities. The point is to realize when it comes to these states, it's evil against evil, and we need to look for other heroes. Lee Kuan Yew is a very good hero to have, even though it's if you get caught chewing gum in Singapore, the police get to baton you or something. Even there, it's so hard to have heroes, but
because they couldn't charge that Hans Hermann Hoppe, that bond you got to pay before you walk in, the legal liability you got.
All righty. This was such a terrific conversation. Everyone, check out Property and Freedom Books for more discussions like this on the most important topics going around. This is the second time I've spoken with.
And our next book is Reclaiming
Marcel.
the American Right.
Yes. Please join the group to engage in some Justin Raimondo wisdom. I should know more about that book. Thank you for reminding me about it. Thank you to everyone for watching Keith and I Don't Tread on Anyone and the Libertarian Institute. Marcel, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me on.